others to join us, and then we can get started. Callum, that's fine.
Grand, thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, feel free to share.
No worries.
Uh,
I'll find some way to share it out once we're done here.
yeah, of course. Um, I think there are a few of us on Twitter with the hashtag Archaeogaming.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
I follow you.
and yeah, yes, yay.
I know, right?
It's a good feeling.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'll hook folks up.
yeah, thank you so much. Looks like we've got. Here we go. Okay, so Lenore, thanks for coming.
Hello.
Hi there. All right, so we should go ahead and get started then. I think we're slotted to go to 1 o'clock Eastern, and thank you, Brett. So we're going to be talking about, I guess, video games in museums. And I'll say right off the bat that I'm going to be more of a participant than any kind of discussion leader at this point. I do know that the games from the Atari excavation that we did last year have wound up in a number of museums, just to get things started. The Smithsonian purchased a copy of E.T. that was excavated from Alamogordo, New Mexico last year. They got it as a part of an eBay auction. The archives at the University of North Dakota got a copy of Centipede. The Video Game Museum in Rome did an exhibition, a temporary exhibition on the Atari excavation and the history of E.T. and the quote-unquote video game crash of the mid-1980s. And I know that MoMA, Museum of Modern Art here in New York, I think last year had an exhibition on video games. And so I'll just start it there, and if you all wanted to kind of pick up and talk about games as museum pieces, display artifacts and things like that, that'd be cool.
I'm muted. There we go.
Oh.
Can everybody hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'm a curator or an assistant curator at the Science and Tech Museum in Ottawa, and we're actually doing a video game exhibit right now. So topical conversation for us. I'm trying to get one of the ET cartridges that was dug up. Fuel, I think, was the company here in Ottawa that worked with you on that.
Sorry, I just took a bite of orzo.
That's okay.
So, yeah, Fuel Entertainment in Canada purchased the rights for the city of Alamogordo to do the excavation. They sold those rights to Microsoft's Lightbox Entertainment.
Oh, okay.
And so Fuel kind of stepped back. They were there for the production, but they stepped back as Lightbox was doing this. You might want to get in touch with Joe Lewandowski, at the city of Alamogordo, and he may have copies that he can loan.
Okay.
And I'm trying to figure out what other museums. I think the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, Michigan also got a copy of E.T. at auction. You might want to write to them to arrange some kind of loan for the exhibit. I know they're going to have that on hand for their Maker Faire in July, but should be able to share that game perhaps after July.
Okay. That's great. And I mean, that's just you talked about ET, so gonna plug we're trying to find one. But I mean, we're actually actively trying to think about how and what to collect for video games, for museums, and that long-term preservation. I think everybody is challenged with that one right now. And I was hoping people might have thoughts. We're kind of looking at right now specifically the Canadian story because it's not represented in any larger collection, and it's significantly difficult for the pre-1994 era in Canada and the BioWare, EA Games, and Ubisoft. So any advice that people have on digging up the remnants of the 1980s is always appreciated.
Okay, anyone? Yeah, I see Lenore.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I can type in the question too, to see. There are a couple of museums that specialize in video games. I mean, Wigamus, and I'll type that in here, which sounds Latin but really isn't. They're in Rome. They're the video game museum, and they put on temporary and permanent exhibits of nothing but games and gaming history. There's a video game museum in Bradford. I think they're either building one or they've just opened one. I'm typing that in too. Which actually ties in with Bradford's department that specializes in media archaeology. And then I believe that there's also a video game museum in Berlin at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, I don't believe that there's any specific installation in the United States or in Canada that dedicates itself, to collections of video games.
In the United States, there's the Strong Museum of Play that has the International Gaming Center.
Right.
But other than that, no, nobody's doing it, and everybody is looking at that international perspective.
Yeah.
But it's really the what are you collecting and what are you preserving? And as archaeologists, we talked in the earlier session about what's been dug up for gaming, and you talked about the excavation of the Atari stuff. But as you look and you try to unpack the artifact, what are we unpacking, and what are we as researchers or curators now collecting that's going to be of use to future researchers?
There is one. You could have maybe talk to the National Museum of Scotland. I'm in Edinburgh, which is where it's based, and I think it was at the end of last year. It was December 2014.
Video games are a
put
worldwide
together
phenomenon,
a thing.
but seeing as they're mostly stuck.
What was it again? Here we are. The Game Masters exhibition. I'll just link this to you. There is part of the commentary on that, and it's got quite a wide swathe of materials in there. I know it's got some early stuff. There's possibly even some cabinets in there. I don't know if that's the sort of thing you'd be interested in, but I know that they at the very least know where to get a lot of these older materials, so you could always have a chat with them. I don't know if it's any use, but they have just done an exhibition, basically.
Right, that's what I guess Adrian had spoken at that by way of introduction to the exhibition once it opened.
Oh yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, Sean, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say I can speak to the Game Masters a little bit. It's a follow-up to I think it's an Australian exhibit actually that's touring internationally.
Right.
And so it's one of those private companies like RMS Titanic or Barbican.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's a bad exhibit. It's the what are we as historians, as archaeologists, what are we trying to preserve? And so it's not Archaeogaming in museums, because let's be honest, who's made a good museum game yet? But it's more, what are we preserving, and what are we trying to preserve, and are we preserving the object? Are we preserving? How are we preserving the code if we're preserving that? And are these things that you guys think about as well? We mentioned, the representation of ancient in games, but do you actually look at the other side and look at the coding side and how to trace the provenance and archaeology of that code?
I know that that's next up for Colleen Morgan and her research at the University of York. And so, she's taking a look at the archaeology of code, or is breaking the games down and getting beyond the physical hardware and into the actual coding of a particular game. And this actually kind of dovetails with one of the things that I've become interested in is kind of the epigraphy or paleography of video game code, where you can start to identify coder hands by how they're basically entering the data as they're making games. I mean, that might be really splitting hairs, but I mean, I figure if we're doing that for stone and for papyrus and stuff, then it makes sense to transfer those skills over to game coding. So that's a possibility as well. I tell you, one of the main criticisms of the video game exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art was the fact that these were the games were being treated as basically works of art and completely divorced of the context of hardware in which they were played or the boxes in which they came. And so people would come and you could play these games, with little controllers on the wall, or you could watch them on screens and whatnot, but it only seemed to give half of the picture. I'd argue that any video game exhibit, must include the hardware in which these games were played. When we were at the University of North Dakota for a one-year reunion of the ET exhibition, we had actually set up several Ataris with a 2600, a 5200, and we had a couple of other things. I think we had a ColecoVision and a Sega Saturn that we'd set up with these big old TVs, and we invited the public to come and play in advance of watching the documentary, and then kind of asking questions of the excavators. And so that kind of hands-on experience, I think, is super important as well.
Yeah, I just answered Lenore there. She mentioned another exhibit. Again, it's the other than the few video game collections that were actually mentioned, there's a couple of archives and libraries that are trying to figure out as playable, but they're not looking at expanding the game as an artifact. And that's what I'm really trying to get at is what is the game as the artifact, and you mentioned it's the playable aspect. So how do you as somebody who would possibly bring these to an institution, make sure that isn't lost when being brought to an institution?
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. I mean, when we were getting these things out, one of the things that we were doing in New Mexico the day after the excavation concluded was we were sorting the games, and we were pulling games that we figured had some kind of historical value, historical merit, not only as being like a rare example of a particular type or title, but also ones that were in significant states of preservation, or that would be illustrative of the mythology that had grown up around the burial itself. So, for example, part of the urban myth was that these games had been covered with a slab of concrete. And while that wasn't necessarily true, there was evidence of concrete slurry that covered some of the games. And so there you're getting kind of historical context around the artifacts that goes beyond them just being a video game, and actually kind of ties them to the archaeology and history of the event of the dumping that happened in 1983. So you have that going on. We had other examples of shrink-wrapped games, of loose cartridges, of comic books, of documentation, of boxes of games of the same title that were being returned to the warehouse in El Paso. And so we have all of these other examples which talk about the history of I guess you call it a history of use, of these particular games that would go beyond just saying, here's a game, from 1983, for example. So you've got that kind of historical context, and we tried to pull those as examples of kind of storytelling of what happened to the games after they were produced and after they were shipped out for consumers.
Okay, yeah, and that's the technical, like that's the provenance of the game and how it was used and how it was found, which is great. I mean, that's half the battle. Otherwise, it's so and so used such and such, and we have to take their word for it.
Right.
Which, yeah, sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. But I'm so you're not actually looking when you were in the field on that one. You weren't actually looking at going beyond the physical hardware of the game and breaking it open a little bit.
One of the things that we wanted to do is to try to find well-preserved examples of the cartridges that could perhaps be playable. And so none of the ones that we pulled were able to be played. As I said in the earlier breakout room, there was one computer guy who bought a copy of the game at auction and was able to figure out how to get it to run via his chip reader, which was terrific, and he actually published a step-by-step on how to do that, and so that was really cool. But for us, I think it was more. If we had more time, we would have been able to do more of that kind of thinking, I guess. But we were under considerable time pressure to get in, document what we could, excavate what we could before the city shut us down. And we had a sandstorm to contend with as well that really kind of screwed things up for us.
Well, thanks for your thoughts there. Great. No, this is something that we're struggling with, and I know there's 3 universities at least in Canada that are struggling with it. A lot of archives are struggling with it. It's ultimately how do we preserve born digital content. And video games is a good place to start because they're that intersection of technology and culture.
Right. If you give me a second, you guys could keep the conversation going. I'm going to take a look for a name of that video game archivist who is terrific. Give me a second, and
okay.
I'll put that into the chat panel.
I suppose this might be a bit of a daft idea, but I don't know if you consider preemptive obtaining of these sorts of materials. Like, for example, if you were to go after Atari stuff now, obviously that's quite difficult to get your hands on, etc. But if you were to identify, and I'm just spitballing, say PS2 materials that 10 years, 15 years down the line would make good archive material, you'd probably be able to get your hands on them a lot more effectively. You'd be able to get your own hardware, guarantee it's preserved.
Callum?
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. That's what needs to be done. I mean, at the end of the month, I'm off to Vancouver, Canada, which is one of the major centers in Canada for video gaming, and I'm meeting with EA Canada for 2 days,
Oh, wow.
and they're responsible for the FIFA franchise and the NHL franchises. But and I'm meeting with Nintendo of Canada and Capcom, just a whole bunch. The issue with that becomes their tight deadlines, and so everything again, it's born digital, and so you're moving quickly towards a tight deadline, and all of that stuff on the back end, and this is where the historic challenge comes in, is it's all a now job, and all that back end stuff is going to a couple of game developers conferences. All this is unimportant, and it's getting people to think that these iterations are important and are worth saving, because most of the time it's like building a scientific instrument in the early prototyping days. The final product is actually a result of the 21st prototypes. So, and you're absolutely right. That is what we want to do for current ones, but it's a challenge as well.
It's rough. It's rough.
No, I'm not trying to say that it's all bad. I mean, we are getting people who are interested. The Canadian firm that does, I don't know if you're familiar with those Skylanders games. Yeah. The Canadian firm Beanox, I guess, does all the artwork and character creation and rapid prototyping, and I just had a wonderful conversation with them today, and they'll be donating an example of that whole process, start to finish.
That's fantastic.
Which is quite spectacular, but not many companies actually keep that legacy. So it's trying to find the right ones that do that.
Hmm. I suppose once you've done that a few times, you can sort of shift the narrative, perhaps. Once you've got successful examples of this in museums, it's part of public understanding of video gaming. Then you'll probably find more people, more companies that are willing to cooperate with that part of the process, or at the very least
Yeah,
willing to account for it.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I was at the Game Developers Conference last week, and I met with the executive producer for Need for Speed by EA Ghost out of Sweden. And I approached him at the very beginning of the conference and said, "This is what we're doing, and this is what I want to talk to you about." And his reaction was his back was bristled a bit, and said,
What?
"Then we don't want you to see what's behind the curtain. We want you to see the final product because that's what we're proud of." And it took 2 days of the conference before he came back to me and said, I've had some time to think about what you've said. That's a really, really good idea, and we should be preserving our stuff. How can we do this?" And this is why I'm talking to various scholars that do this type of thing, or at least think about these types of things, to figure out the best way to do this.
Put into the chat panel the name of the video game archivist, as well as a link to a blog post that she did on this very topic. But I mean, we're talking about archiving, preservation, and ultimately probably exhibiting these video games that have come out that people like, and I'm wondering if we really should be doing this also for games that never made it. So for example, I guess there's the new Silent Hill game that got canceled last month to public outcry and dismay, and so what are they doing with everything that they had done, with the art and the storyboarding and any preliminary code and whatever? And what about those games that get fully developed, but then the publisher, for whatever reason, decides to throw them away? And we also talk about copyright law. There's a new, I guess, copyright law, at least in the U.S., which basically kind of makes illegal all of these abandonware sites. So games and ROMs and MAMEs and things that people have put up, for preservation and for playing, from the 80s and early 90s, that are now illegal to play, use, and download. And so all of a sudden, it becomes the responsibility of the company that produced these games to archive them and to preserve them if they want to. And I don't think they're going to. Just a statement, not a question, but.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the copyright law, I know that in Canada, and this is going to be one of our challenges when we move towards exhibition, is we want to have playable games, but sequences of the games that best illustrate the topic that we're trying to speak about. And first of all, you need to emulate that game to only access the playable sequence that you want, but it's technically illegal because I can have a copy of the ROM if I own the game,
Yeah.
and I have the ROM strictly as a backup and I don't use it. The minute I start to play with the ROM or I go get the ROM from somebody else, I'm breaking the law. So we as an institution can't do that. So we're speaking to the larger players about getting them to work with us to develop these short ROMs.
Yes.
But I know that when the MoMA acquired the Bjork app, I'll put it in the comments later. It's an app for Bjork's music. They actually had the producers of the video game actually sign over the source code and let the MoMA actually manipulate and play with the source code as long as they didn't sell or distribute it.
Okay. Seems like a good common ground, maybe. Hmm. So for others on the call, in this particular breakout room, what are your interests, or are you specializing in museum studies or game studies, or what is your interest in working with video games in the context of museums?
Does someone else want to go first, or?
I mean, we can keep working, on Sean's issue, but if anybody else has anything, that they'd like to say within the, working within the context of museums and video games, by all means, let's talk about it. We've got about 20 minutes before the session concludes.
Hello.
Yeah.
No.
Okay, we can hear you. Yes.
I know the Computer Game Museum in Berlin. It's a public institution. It opens in 2011, and they try to deal with all the cultural aspects of gaming, and they even have a big archive, and they have all the old games and the games as artifacts from the early 80s till now, and they also have all kinds of magazines writing about gaming culture. They have the original hardware, and they try to talk about how gaming changed our culture and all these aspects. And I think it's a good example for a public institution, for a computer game museum, and yeah. And one other point. When you look at games as artifacts or reconstruction the code, a good example, maybe it's not a game, but you have they found some old hard drives from the old Amiga computer of Andy Warhol, and they still reconstructed some pictures from it, and I think this process is also some kind of archaeology.
I agree, Daniel. Again, if you go back to what the University of York is doing with Sarah Perry and Colleen Morgan specifically in the Department of Archaeology there, their project over the past 2 years has been to excavate a thumb drive that I think they found on the sidewalk. And so they picked up the thumb drive, they recorded the context of the thumb drive as far as its find spot, brought it back to the lab, and then they began to do an archaeological analysis of the contents of the drive itself, trying to establish ownership, but also looking at the contents and how it was organized, in effect doing almost a Harris matrix of the contents on that drive. And so definitely, we're looking at this kind of media. I don't know if you want to call it media archaeology, because it's real archaeology, but it's the archaeology of media. And so yeah, I think that it's perfectly valid to consider that to be an archaeological pursuit of this kind of deconstruction or this kind of analysis of taking a physical object and then going inside to take a look at the underpinning of the code and organization therein, to learn about what's on there, but also to learn about its owner, which is something that's typical of dirt archaeologists.
Yeah, you find some comment in the code from the programmers and things like that.
That's true. It's not unlike marginalia in manuscripts. You've got the bored monks that are drawing dirty pictures on the sides of the manuscripts and stuff. And so, looking through the code, I'd be willing to bet that you're going to find commented out pieces, of things in there, as the folks are writing. I'd love to see something like that.
Well,
You have some archaeologists who deals with the artifacts from Earth as some kind of archives. You have the artifacts are a kind of communication itself, who must be decrypted, and so there are very many similarities to the work of archaeology. I think when you deal with a picture of an archaeologist as a hacker or something like that, that could be possible. I think.
We need to come up with a term for the hacker archaeologist, because I do think that's a really valid point. I don't know if you call it hackeology or what you would call it. But I mean, we were emailing about this back and forth, and yeah, I mean, part of what archaeology does is we're kind of hacking the past anyway, and so this is taking it in a very kind of literal sense as far as how we're getting in and how we're, we run into this problem, when we're talking about preserving any kind of digital media, I guess, and the fact that we don't necessarily have the hardware or the software to read what was written, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. We're dependent on the hardware or some kind of conversion service to get the media to a point where we can actually open it up and take a look. And so, we're looking at this kind of conservation of media, conservation of this digital stuff. I can't look at coins that come up in a hoard of coins that are excavated from the bottom of the seafloor because it's just a big mass of metal, and we have to go through and we've got to carefully separate these coins out, get them clean so that we can begin to understand what's there. And I think that's a good analog for what it is that we're going to be doing in the next 100 years for anything digital that was produced between now and 50 years ago.
It does pose a pretty interesting question, because I was actually a bit of a pet project of mine has been sort of building myself a time capsule, and the original plan was, I'll just put the entire works of Wikipedia on it. You can do that now. You just get yourself a flash drive, and then I started looking into flash drive, how long that's actually going to last, and it becomes a bit more of an issue. They're doing some stuff with, I can't remember what the name is, but it's something to do with actual crystalline methods. It's like an actual disc, but it's made of some form of stone. I'm not actually sure what the detail is, but that is the only way to get long preservation. So I'm almost thinking...
You mean this Millennium Disc?
Yeah, that's the thing. I've been hearing about this.
Wait, what is this?
Go for it.
It keeps you can use it for about 1,000 years. They tell us about this new kind of
data storage, I guess.
Container, or
okay.
And even the archaeologists are producing much of digital media and artifacts. There's also the digitalization process of the archives is going on, and so there are also aspects of preserving digital media and data. It's important for archaeologists too, and but about these archaeologists as a hacker thing, I don't think that you have to know a programming language or something like that if you work as an archaeologist. You don't even know how to make a C14 analysis. The people how know it, and it's a topic of only of connection. You don't have to know the details about these processes as an archaeologist. You only have to have to know the context or something like that to open archaeology for other aspects. I think. I'm sorry, I need a little more practice in my English, but
No, it's fine.
Läuft.
So, I mean, but if I'm hearing you correctly, Daniel, it's basically saying, it's up to the archaeologist to recognize the context of or the nature of the artifact that's found, and then when it comes time to open it up or to conserve it or to read it, there will be people available who have that skill set that we can delegate to, much like we do now. Is that right?
yes, you have to collect the people who know the things, and you have to tell them how to do it in a archaeological way, and you have to connect with these other scientific directions or people who know the practice of these things, and give them the right context for archaeology. I think the archaeology always was open for other influences, and I think this is also important for the digital age.
We've got a little less than 10 minutes to go. So are there other topics that you want to talk about or things that we want to bring up again?
I've got one, but it's kind of off topic, but on topic.
It's an unhangout, unconference. So
yeah, it's really about, because I don't know if any of you are aware, our museum is relaunching in 2017 for the Sesquicentennial of Canada, which is great. Go team. We're finally getting an influx of federal money we were a centennial project, so at 50 years we get more money. But one of the things that we're challenged with is that new digital museum, where gaming is going to play a part of it. Now, this is more of you as visitors. Have you actually seen a museum do video games or gamification experiences well? And if you have, which ones?
I have not.
It depends, I guess, what age group you're aiming it at. I have some relatively fuzzy memories of Dynamic Earth, which is more of a geological and hard science museum in Edinburgh, and they've just got lots of fairly quite straightforward interactive panels. It's not got any real depth in it, but they're at child height. The sort of there is. It depends what you're aiming at. I think there is a lot of these sorts of low-scale things that you could do. If you're just trying to introduce, say, kids to the concept of gaming, you might even be better off making a very basic introductory thing yourselves and just making sure that they can access it, rather than having to pick out anything and worry about rights issues and so forth, because I'm pretty sure they made all their stuff custom, or at the very least they hired in somebody to do it. I mean, this would have been a decade ago now. The touchscreens had just come in.
Yeah.
And kids loved these. I don't know what the demographic is of your institution, but if you're, it depends really. I guess you have to think a bit more about who you're aiming it at.
Yeah, I mean, here at Science and Tech, it's families with small children is what we call our age group. So
there you go.
At about 8 years old, kids tend to stop coming unless the school has forced them to come. That's just the nature of it. But it's, we've had touchscreens in the institution before, but this is really how can you think about, and gamification is that word that gets thrown around, but how do you think about blending the physical and the gaming experience in a museum setting? And I know Sean Graham and I have had a few discussions about this before, but I like picking other people's brains too.
Well, I mean, I come from a school of thought that any more interaction is good interaction. The more experience that there is actually there being had, the more it's going to stick. So, yeah, really quite. I mean, it's not exactly a complex view, I suppose. I'm probably not adding much, but the more the merrier, really. So, it's you don't want to just go in there and look at stuff. You want to go in there and do things.
Right.
So it was.
I think we both said right at the same time.
Yeah. That is ultimately as complicated as my opinion is.
And that's good. Multiple opinions are what does it, and really uncomplicated opinions are the easiest to process.
Fantastic. I've got lots of uncomplicated opinions.
Sorry, Daniel,
Yes.
have you actually been to the computer museum or the video game museum?
Yeah, I went there. It's some years ago before it opens. I worked for them about for 2 or 3 months. It was the first point I thought about archaeology and gaming, and I was going through the archives and try to collect games with an archaeology context and something like that, and thought about how to handle this topic in an archaeology context. And I think it's a very interesting project because it's a public institution with a permanent exhibition with public money and all the things and criteria all other museums must fit in, and it's a kind of project which is very unique in the moment. There aren't much other museums which are organized this way and tried to talk about the whole aspects of gaming, culture, artifacts, and things like that. Perhaps it could be a good idea to visit the museum or meet there or ask them if they are interested to support this Archaeogaming thing, or perhaps it's a good place to hold a conference or something like that. And I think it's a good spot. Was it your question?
Yeah, no, I was wondering if it worked there more specifically because, I know their collection is a more international focus, but did they take extra time to think about European game development and flesh out that collection more, or was it really a broad international collection?
It is an international collection, and you also have the original hardware there, where you can find the original experience in gaming with the original hardware. This was one aspect which was important for them. And you also have the development process and the documentation of some kinds of game development, even some special topics like gaming in Eastern Europe or something like that, how they are influenced by some special kind of gaming machines and things like that. And yes.
Well, thank you.
Okay, it's time for our break. Sean has invited us to keep the good discussion going if you like. I need to excuse myself for just a moment, and we'll reconvene for the third and final breakout sessions at about 1:15.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks everybody for your insight.